Hello and welcome back. This is the next video in the certification called Sustainability Climate Risk. This video would discuss chapter 11 to 15 of this certification. These are the presentation outline for this video. Let's study them one by one. So the first is impact investment. So definition of impact investing is the investment which is made into companies or organizations that has positive impact on social and environmental alongside the financial returns. So these are the different principles of impact investing. So the very first principle states that it needs to align with SDG. The scale or intensity of intended portfolio impact should be proportionate to the size of investment portfolio. The second one, it establishes and monitors impact performance of whole portfolio. It also aligns staff incentive with impact achievement. The third one, a narrative needs to be established and documented, which should be clear in terms of evidence. The fourth one is the definition of intended impact, who experiences it, how significant it is. It would also assess the probability of achieving intended impact. Also, there would be indicators that will be aligned to industry standards and best practices. The fifth one is to identify, avoid, and manage ESG risk. It would also monitor investors' ESG risk and address gaps. The sixth one would use result framework from principle number 4. It would also tell about how data is collected, method for its collection, as well as sources. The seventh one, so the exits are not inevitable, but sometimes they need to be done. So this would study the effect of timing, structure, and process of exit. The eighth one would use the findings to improve operation and strategic investment decisions. The ninth one, which is publicly disclosure, this would be done on an annual basis, but public disclosures are subject to fiduciary and regulatory concerns. Now the next topic that was discussed in this chapter was ESG definition. So it measures sustainable and ethical impact of an investment. So what is ESG? E stands for environmental, which is how company performs as steward of natural environment. S stands for social, which is how company manages relationship with employees, suppliers, customers, etc. G stands for governance, which deals with leadership, executive pay, audit, risk, etc. Now, responsible investment has been going considerably in the last few decades. It is given by UN, which decides this based on the investors who make it for themselves. This principle for responsible investment is a voluntary and aspirational set of investment principles that offer menu of possible action for incorporating ESG into practice. It is developed by investors for investors. The motive is to create a more sustainable global financial system which would align with investors' objective of society. Now, what is the growth of responsible investment has been? So the first is the financial materiality. Climate-related risks have been affecting the finances of various portfolios. The second is the short-termism effect. So climate-related risks are not known to affect the portfolio in a short-term manner, but they affect in the long-term manner. What are the long-term drivers? Risk as well as return are the long-term drivers for climate-related risk. But investors also have the fiduciary duty to take ESG as a financial risk, just because they need to act in the best interest of their investors. Public policy, government also is putting large amount of focus on climate related risk and differentiation. Now, what are the principles of responsible investment? The first is to align. So this would address ESG issues in investment policy statement. It would also assess internal and external managers' capability and also incorporate ESG. It would encourage academic and other research on ESG. The second is impact and target setting. It would develop and disclose active ownership policy which is consistent with principles. It would develop an engagement capability. Investors would participate in collaborative engagement initiatives. The third one is client and customers. So a standardized ESG reporting system would be followed, such as GRI. It can also ask ESG to be integrated into annual financial reports. It would also support shareholder resolution, which would promote ESG disclosures. The fourth is stakeholders. So they would align investment mandates with performance indicators and incentive structures with ESG. If ESG is not incorporated, then investors would revisit their relationship. They would also support regulatory or policy development to enable these principles. Principle 5, which is governance structure. So this would support or participate in network and in information platforms. It would develop collaborative initiatives as well. The sixth one, which is transparency and initiative. This would disclose how ESG are integrated into investment practices, what are the active ownership activities, and what is required from service providers. It would also seek to determine impact of principles. It can make use of reporting to raise awareness about broad group of stakeholders. So what are the principles of responsible banking? So as you can see, these 6 principles has been divided into 6 different parts. The first principle is to incorporate ESG issues into investment analysis. The second principle is towards active owners. The third principle is to disclose ESG related activities. The fourth principle is to promote acceptance and implementation. The fifth principle is to collaborate with like-minded parties. Sixth principle is to report progress and activities towards implementing these principles. Now, these are the different types of principle. Now, let's study them one by one. So, for the principle 1, which is alignment, this would focus on SDGs that are most relevant to banks' operating context. So, principle 1 is to understand the business requirement of it. If there is misalignment, then they need to study about it. Board commitment is a necessary thing for principles of responsible banking. For the principle 2, the impact setting needs to be smart, that is specific, measurable, analytical, research and timing. Impact analysis needs to be taken into consideration, which would discuss about the scope, scale of exposure, content and relevance, as well as scale of intensity. Another thing is that impact settings should be forward-looking, just because climate-related risks are affecting in long term. There needs to be strategies based on how to develop new products for new clients. The third is client principle, which was client and customers. So for this, a systemic identification needs to be done, where bank can help clients in decreasing the impact of negative impact and increasing the impact of positive impact. There needs to be strategic partnership with third parties if possible. Banks would need to build capacity to incorporate climate-related risk. Also, they should give incentive to their employees and other parties who help in incorporation of ESG, incorporation of climate-related risk in portfolio. Principle 4, which was stakeholders. So a stakeholder analysis needs to be done, which would tell the impact, the influence and the impact of each stakeholder. They need to consult, engage and partner with various third parties. Also, there would be periodic review of this stakeholder analysis. Just because some stakeholders would go out of the portfolio or some stakeholders would come inside. Principle 5, which is governance and structure. So in this, rules and responsibility would be discussed. Expertise, if it is in-house, that would be developed or it would be taken from outside. This would help in the decision making of ESG related risk. Also, remuneration would be decided based on incorporation of ESG related risk. Principle 6, so which is transparency and accountability. So annual transparency report would be constructed by banks. They need to align and integrate the disclosures with their existing disclosures. There need to be a governance mechanism system which will study how climate-related risks are impacting their own analysis. Now the next chapter is TCFD recommendation. So the task force was constructed in 2017. It has 4 different heads, which is governance, structure, risk management, and work metrics and targets. TCFD believes that disclosures by financial sector would foster an early assessment of climate-related risk and opportunities. It also believes that asset managers and asset owners, including public and private sector, can inculcate them. Climate-related financial disclosure need to be made at mainstream, like annual financial reports. So these are the various recommendations. Let's study them one by one. So for the governance, this is the thing in which organizations' governance around climate-related risk are disclosed. The second is strategy, which would discuss about the actual and potential impact of climate-related risk. The third is risk management, that would identify, assess, and manage impact of climate-related risk. And the fourth would construct metrics and targets for this climate-related risk, and if possible, their opportunities would be encapsulated. So let's study these recommended disclosures one by one. So the first is the board oversight. As you can see, it would decide about the process and frequency of risk reporting. The second would be analysis and overseeing. So analysis of this climate-related risk would be discussed here. Management role. So what kind of organization structure would study risk management would be discussed here. How the risk would be informed and monitored, that would also be discussed here. Risk and opportunities. So most of these risks are in different phases, that is short, medium and long term. So this would be discussed here. What are the processes of determination? So how the climate-related risk would be determined, that would be discussed in this heading. What is the impact of this climate-related risk on business, strategy, and financial planning would be discussed here. So the climate-related risk impacts products and services, which could be in supply chain, it could be in value chain, adaptation and mitigation activities, R&D investment, operations, etc. It would also be input to business, strategy, and financial planning. Another thing is resilience to 2-degree scenario, which was discussed in Paris Agreement. So this would discuss the strategies that would be resilient to climate-related risk and opportunities. Which strategies would be used and what are the different scenarios and time horizon would also be discussed here. The other is the organization processes. So as you can see, there would be some existing and emerging regulatory disclosure as per the countries that are involved. Risk definition and classification would be discussed here. Another is to manage climate-related risk. So this would include mitigation, transfer, accept, and controlling the risk. How the material determination would be done would be discussed here. Integration, so different processes for identification, assessment, and management of climate-related risk would be discussed in this heading. Metrics that needs to be disclosed. So the very first metrics, which is based on water, energy, land use, and waste management. Performance metric would also be discussed about the kind of employees that are relevant to climate-related risk. Also, historical analysis for climate-related risk would be discussed. If there is no historic analysis, methodology should be described in which way to go about it. Another is to disclose scope 1, 2, and 3 of emission standards. So 1 and 2 are quite simple to calculate, whereas scope 3 is difficult to calculate. We would be studying this in the next video. So scope 1, 2, and 3 would be done through GHG protocol. This needs to be generally accepted. There needs to be a trend analysis so that you can identify the forthcoming risks. Now, what are the targets? So key targets such as GHG emission, where water users as well as energy users would be studied. There are 3 different criteria in it. So targets should consider whether targets are absolute or intensity based, whether they are following the time frame over which targets applies, also the base year for which progress is measured, and the KPI to assess against target. So this is the TCFD recommendation. Now TCFD did recommend it on non-financial groups as well. So the non-financial groups are energy, transportation, materials and buildings, agriculture, foods and forest services. Energy can be further classified into oil and gas, coal and electric utilities. Transportation is various kind of transportation in air, maritime, rail, trucking, etc. Material and building would include metal and mining, chemicals, construction material, etc. Agriculture, food and forest products would include beverage, agriculture, etc. Now the next is NGFS. So NGFS is the body of central banks. They were mandated to incorporate climate-related risk into financial system, which they did by 3 different mechanisms, which is price stability, financial stability, and safety. Now, these are the different recommendations of NGFS. So the first is integration of climate-related risk into financial stability. This would map physical as well as transmission risk channels. It would also conduct a quantitative climate-related risk to size the risk across financial system. Physical and transition risk will be included to forecast macroeconomic effects. The second is to integrate sustainable factors into own portfolio. So central banks would need to be lead by example in this. They need to integrate sustainability into management of their own portfolio, which is bond markets and all. They should also incorporate this into their monetary policy. The third is the bridging data gaps. So they need to appoint public authority for sharing of data that is relevant to climate risk assessment and make them publicly available. The fourth is building awareness and intellectual capacity. So central banks would use their own capacity to understand climate-related factors, technical assistance, and knowledge sharing. They would encourage relevant parties. Now, these 4 are mandated towards central banks and supervisors. The next 2 are towards policymakers. So N5, which is achieving robust and internationally consistent climate and related disclosures. So members would pledge their support for TCFD and would adopt it. The 6th one, which is to support a common taxonomy of economic activities. This would contribute to transition to green and low carbon economy. This would be more exposed to climate and environment related risk. NGFS in future would develop handbook on climate and environment related risk. This is a voluntary guideline in scenario-based risk analysis. The best practices would be incorporated into sustainable criteria. So this was what was discussed in these chapters. I hope you like this video. Subscribe to this channel, like, share and comment, and we will meet soon.